I want to thank Aisling for inviting me to give the inaugural lecture at the opening of your center. It's my honor to be able to participate. I must say that the topics that were outlined are quite impressive. It looks like a very productive and active group of scholars that will, in all likelihood, make a significant impact on what we're all about. One caveat before we begin. I know Aisling mentioned my 1996 paper on letting all the flowers bloom. To disappoint you a little bit, when I get later into my presentation, I'm going to make an argument that looks like I'm sort of undermining that position. But I think there's a very good reason for it. The reason I wrote that paper 25 years ago, more or less, was I thought there was a group of SLA scholars that were trying to set the field in a very specific direction, and who believed that the only way to go was to look for language acquisition inside the head. And I think that was a misplaced position. And actually, if you read Jeff Jordan's book, 2004, he sort of agrees with me. But I'll say more about that as we go through the presentation. So as I said, this is part of a two-part presentation on the crisis in SLA. I think there's a second one, which is the theory, which is the cognitive social divide. And I think that one sort of dovetails with this one, the theory-practice divide. And I think Vogusky's theory actually has a way of overcoming them, not so much by bridging the gap, but by actually unifying theory-practice and social cognitive. And let me just preface this by saying sociocultural theory is not a sociolinguistic theory. It's a cognitive theory, but in a different sense of cognitive, because it looks for the mind outside of the body, at least in part. And I'll try to make that clear as we go through the presentation. Okay, so the goal of my presentation is to look at the nature and the origin of the crisis. I use the term crisis because it's the term that Vogusky used when he was just breaking into psychology, making the transition from literary theorist and secondary school teacher to psychology. And he saw that there was a crisis in psychology because there were at least, well, two major approaches to the study of what it means to be a human being and to have human consciousness. One was the idealist position represented in the work of people like Husserl and Freud, and to some extent Hegel, although that was more philosophical, and the materialist position, which was represented in the work of the behaviorists and the American behaviorists and the Russian reflexologists, Pavlov and in Russia, and Watson and Thorndike, and eventually Skinner in the US. So I think there's a similar crisis, as I'm going to try to show in the presentation. Now, I'm going to make a distinction between SLA as a process and SLS as second language studies. So I want to distinguish the process from the field, okay? And then I'm going to talk about why the crisis is a problem and how we might overcome the crisis, following more or less the approach that Vogusky took to resolve the crisis in psychology. Now, the nature of the crisis, and this is the key point. Can theory and research into the process of SLA inform language teaching? And if we go back in time, as I will do in a minute, there was a transition from applied linguistics to SLS, second language studies. And the transition actually was from applied research to basic research. Many people wanted, beginning in the 1970s, wanted to make SLS, second language studies, a discipline that engaged in basic research, not applied research. And then the problem becomes, does a theory of SLA contribute to language instruction? And if so, how? Now, the crisis at least in part, began, at least in the US, with the rise of applied linguistics during the Second World War in what was called the Army method. And the Army method was developed by people at universities such as Michigan, Georgetown, Cornell, Indiana. And they used principles of structural linguistics and behavioral psychology to inform language pedagogy. And this is ultimately, when this method was transferred over to education, it became known as the audiolingual method. And it was based largely on contrastive analysis. And the idea was to develop a comparison between the target language and the native language. And where there were similarities, you would assume that there would be fewer errors, and where there were differences, the assumption was their learners would produce errors, right? So if you look at a language like English and Spanish, Spanish has a robust aspect system. English does not nearly as robust as Spanish. And so you would expect that English learners of Spanish would have problems learning the aspectual system, and to a certain of Spanish, and to a certain degree, that's actually not so far off the mark. But in 1967, thereabouts, S. Pitt-Corder began to look at the kinds of errors that learners were creating, and he noticed that there were systematic errors that they were creating, and they were not limited to the target language versus native language differences. They were doing such things as overgeneralizing. So you get run becomes rand in the past tense instead of ran on the model of walk walked. And Pitt-Corder argued that applied linguistics was not a producer of theories, but a consumer of theories. So applied linguistics, he thought, was fundamentally a consumer discipline, let's say. And so it used theory at three levels. One was the description of the target language. Another one was the incorporation of this description into a viable syllabus. And the third level was the teaching techniques to implement the syllabus. All of these was based on the consumption of particular theories. But the question becomes which theories. We'll come back to this in a bit. So in the early 70s, people like Dule, Burt, and Krashen began to expand and extend the error analysis research of Pitt-Corder into what's known now as the famous morpheme-order studies. And they noticed that learners of different L1s follow the same sequence for acquiring English as a second language. And you see here what at the time was assumed to be the order. So moving from top to bottom. And you couldn't acquire what was on the bottom until you acquired what was on the top of this assumed sequence. Now, a little bit later, researchers became interested in SLA as a psycholinguistic process in its own right. And they felt, particularly led by people like Michael Long, that they should be engaged in theory-informed basic research along the models proposed by Kuhn in his work on scientific nature of scientific revolutions. At the time, according to Long, there were something like 60 theories, models, and hypotheses, such as Krashen's monitor model, Schumann's acculturation model, Selinker's interlanguage model, and Pieneman's processability theory, and there are many more now. Now, the question that has to be asked, does second language studies research have an obligation to inform language practice? Martin Bygate, in a 2005 paper that appeared in Applied Linguistics, says that the field still views it still views itself as synonymous with an approach to language teaching. Rod Ellis, in 2010, argued that at the heart of the field of SLS is still applied linguistics rather than a pure discipline. So the question is, does second language studies have the accumulated knowledge necessary to appropriately inform language pedagogy? So if you're going to inform pedagogy, you need to have an accumulated body of knowledge that everyone agrees upon, as often happens in the so-called hard or physical sciences. Now, almost from the beginning, people expressed doubts. In the 1976 paper that appeared in T-Cell Quarterly, Elaine Tyrone, Meryl Swain, and Ann Fathman argued that second language studies was still in its infancy, and therefore it was not ready to propose valid and reliable guidelines needed to effect curriculum change. So they felt that the field was certainly no way ready to inform pedagogy because it hadn't accumulated sufficient knowledge. Evelyn Hatch, in a 1978 paper in Studies of Second Language Acquisition, argued that the research findings of SLS, if applied at all, should be done with caution. That's a sort of a leitmotif that appears throughout the history of SLS. Apply, but apply with caution. Patsy Lightbaum, in a 1985 paper, argued that second language studies is still not in a position. This is 10 years later, more or less, from the original Tyrone and Fathman paper, and Swain. SLS is not in a position to offer teachers specific guidance on what should be done in classrooms, but it can highlight the expectations for what can be achieved in classroom settings. So the field is sort of beginning to make some kind of recommendations, not in terms of guidance, but in terms of what can be expected as a result of classroom instruction. Now, as we'll see, this is going to be a controversial issue. In the 2000 anniversary or Applied Linguistics issue that celebrated the turning of the millennium, Lightbaum then said that second language studies can offer some guidance. So it looks like we're moving in a good direction. It can offer information on what is achievable, as she said 15 years earlier, but it also can offer valuable cues to effective pedagogical practice. But you still have to apply with caution. So if you're a teacher, what do? Apply, but apply with caution. What does that mean? Dick Allwright, in a 2005 piece in T-Cell Quarterly, says that SLS is of negligible value to current classroom participants who need their understandings now. So he's saying we can't wait for the knowledge to be accumulated because people have to teach language, and we can't wait for the field to accumulate the knowledge necessary because people are trying to teach and learn languages. Gass and Mackey, again, says apply, but with restraint. They say basic research is not sufficiently mature to bridge the gap between theory and practice. So again, we see some into the first decade of the new millennium, that people feel the field is not yet mature enough. And Jan Hostein, several years later, says it's still a young discipline. So we see there's a crisis beginning to build, right? What does the field have to offer language pedagogy? Well, we don't seem to know. Okay, so what to do about the crisis? Okay, so how do we cope with the crisis? Rod Ellis, in his 1997 book, says second language studies still is in a state of relative infancy. So again, you apply with caution. In 2005, he says it's still a very young field. Advice should be understood as tentative and provisional. In 2010, he says SLS is an established discipline, and he proposes 11 principles for preparing L2 teachers. But 10 years later, he goes back to the field being an immature field, because he says in a paper that just appeared in Language Teaching, he says SLS has come a long way, but it's still at the early stage of becoming a discipline. So he says it's not even a discipline. It does it have relevance for addressing practical problems? And maybe it's at best a subfield of applied linguistics. So what to do? Well, if we look across the field, and this goes back to my Letting All the Flowers Bloom paper, there are a number of theories, models, hypotheses, approaches, and perspectives. Not everything is a real theory. There are probably more models, hypotheses, approaches, and perspectives than there are real theories in the Kuhnian sense of theory. So if you look at these three books, Dwight Atkinson's book on alternative approaches to second language acquisition, and Mitchell, Miles, and Marsden's 2013 third edition, and there's now a fourth edition that just appeared, and Van Patten and Keating and Wolf's third edition of their paper on second language, introducing second language theories, you find that there are at least 18 different theories. So which one of these theories is relevant, and what do they have to offer? It looks to me like it's quite confusing. If you're a language teacher, where do I go? Some theories are saying something, and some theories are saying next to nothing. How relevant, for example, is universal grammar for language teaching? Do teachers need to know all of these theories? And then how do they select from these theories to inform their pedagogy? So you see the field is still, my way of thinking, is still in a crisis. So one of the things you can do is, of course, go back to Long's idea, is you can reduce the number of theories, models, hypotheses, and processes, and which enables researchers to engage in normal science. So if you're going to accumulate knowledge, you have to develop a body of researchers, a cohort of researchers who are involved in accumulating knowledge. That's what Kuhn calls normal science, right? Guided by some theory. So if you accumulate knowledge that will be relevant to practical problems, that's what some people feel should be the goal of SLS. Not everybody. Some people think it's about doing basic research, similar to theoretical physics, and if it doesn't have relevance, so be it. Now, how do you reduce the theories? That's of course the problem, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote that 96 paper. So you can follow these guidelines proposed by Long. You can look at the theory's internal consistency, systematicity, clarity, scope, generality. There are other things that scientists have argued need to be part of theories. Making novel predictions, I think, is very important. Falsifiability is something you hear all the time, but that's fairly controversial. Maybe we can talk about that in the question and answer session. So to summarize the crisis, in Rod Ellis's second edition of his massive tome on studies in second language acquisition, he says, there's now more disagreement about the facts of L2 acquisition. There are challenges to acquisition orders and sequences, which we all thought were, at the time, pretty much established science. Well, it turns out that's not so. There are challenges to the so-called critical period hypothesis. There are challenges to the concept of fossilization. So then the question becomes, is second language studies a field of cognitive psychology, or should it also encompass sociolinguistic lines of inquiry as proposed by Firth and Wagner and some other people more recently, people doing work on conversational analysis, for example. So he concludes that it's not possible to produce a neat summary of what is known about SLA. It would be unwise and probably impossible to produce such a summary. So if we summarize the crisis, given the current state of affairs, how can theory research possibly inform classroom practice with confidence rather than with caution? And there are 5 concerns. One of the concerns is, as I outlined, multiple theories. And should they be cognitive or social, or both? And I talk about that in my other paper on the crisis. How do you get the cognitive and the social together in a unified way? What about the research methodology? What counts as research methodology? Is it all about controlled experiments? Or are there other kinds of research methodology that we can engage in? Is there such a thing as a built-in syllabus that would account for the apparent fact, that all learners follow a similar sequence in acquiring a particular language or a particular feature of a language? And this one I think is crucial, number 4. Does changing the setting where learning happens, does it affect the acquisition process? Now, Michael Long argued that wherever, from a cognitive perspective, wherever second language acquisition occurs, whether it's in a classroom, whether it's an immersion setting, or anything in between, it's going to be the same process, because the mind is the mind. The other question is implicit knowledge a necessary condition for second language acquisition? There are many people that argue that implicit knowledge is in fact necessary. While explicit knowledge might help, implicit knowledge is crucial. That's again based on how children acquire language implicitly. But adults don't necessarily have to acquire language implicitly. We can talk about that more during the question and answer period. So, the problem, I think, is that we've created a dualism, and this goes back to Vogusky's idea of the dualism between idealist psychology and materialist psychology. And the crisis arises from dualistic thinking, where you get this distinction between theory and basic research and the concrete application in the real world inhabited by real people. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Dwight Atkinson. We're not dealing with the learner, right, as we often talk about in the SLA research. We're talking about human beings, it says, as I know them, whether they're people on the street, students I teach and work with, professional colleagues, or those I'm close to and love, appear to act, think, and feel in ways, and for reasons entirely different than those most typically featured in SLA research. And this is what Vogusky was about. Vogusky was about dealing with real people, regardless of what their capacities to learn were. His belief was, if you didn't have the capacity to learn, it's the responsibility of the researcher practitioner to help those individuals learn. And we might have to use different approaches to education. He wrote a little bit about language education, but just education in general. So how do we overcome this? Now, I think there are 3 options. We can change the power structure between researchers and teachers to liberate teachers from what Jacobowitz and Gordon call the tyranny of irrelevant expertise. I think that speaks for itself, right? We can try to bridge the theory-practice gap by providing teachers with the findings of SLS research. But what are the agreed-upon findings? And what about eclecticism? As Marvin Harris, American anthropologist, says, eclecticism is what we do when we don't know what we're doing. So we do a little bit of everything and just hope something works. Or maybe we can develop a new theory that unifies theory and practice in an inseparable dialectically organized integration. And that's what I'm going to propose. So if we take the first option, the first option basically deprivileges the experimental laboratory. This is what makes expertise tyrannical and irrelevant, but it doesn't, you can't rule out the possibility that there could be interesting things found in the experimental laboratory. Vogusky certainly did experimental research, but we'll see what his view was on that a little bit later. So as Milo Stafermos says there's a new interesting book that just came out. It's called Revisiting Vogusky for Social Change. And it's an edited volume. And Stafermos, in his the first chapter, says the following: there's nothing more dangerous for practitioners than the blind faith in empirical data because it conceals the complexity of the real world. That goes back to Dwight Atkinson's issue. So you might be able to deal with the learner in an experimental laboratory, but the learner is not a real person. It's the learner, right? It's sort of a composite of something. Solution 2, which was proposed by Ellis before he felt the field was really still not mature and not worthy of being a discipline, we can inform teachers of the research findings of second language acquisition, but which findings? Which theory? UG says something very different from social theory, says something very different from conversational analysis. And we can develop the strategies for transferring knowledge between researchers and teachers. We can summarize the pedagogical implications of research. We can engage in case studies, and we can do researcher-teacher collaboration, or we can do teacher research, which I think, as I'm going to argue in a little bit, actually makes a lot of sense. But how we understand teacher research, I think, is different for Vogusky than the way it's understood in the current SLS literature. So eclecticism then is where we select from different theories, as I just mentioned, and research findings and try to piece together a unified approach to teaching. As I said, Marvin Harris says eclecticism is what we do when we don't know what we're doing. Similar to what psychologists attempted as a way out of the dualism crisis in psychology. So they tried to find a way of fitting Marx into Freud. And no matter how hard you try, you cannot fit Marx into Freud or Freud into Marx. It just isn't going to work because they're incompatible. They're incommensurable theories. But people tried to do that as a way of overcoming the crisis. And Vogusky recognized we need a completely new theory. These are some of the principles that Rosemary Erlin proposed, following, again, Ellis's 2010 suggestion that we can inform teachers of what the findings are. So ensure that learners focus on meaning, but also on form. Well, that seems obvious. Provide opportunities for interaction and output practice. Take account of individual differences. Yes. Test free and controlled production. Ensure learners develop a repertoire of formulaic expressions and rule-based competence. Well, I question whether linguistic ability is based on rules, whether we actually internalize rules, or whether we internalize something else, which I will call concepts, conceptual knowledge, rather than rules in the traditional sense of the kinds of pedagogical rules that you find in most textbooks. You know, if this, then that. If you use an adverb like yesterday or last week in Spanish, you have to use the preterite. Well, that's just not true. That's not an accurate characterization of how you use aspect in Spanish. Ensure that learners develop implicit knowledge, but don't ignore explicit knowledge. Well, I have serious doubts about whether in a classroom in particular, and maybe even in immersion settings, adults can actually acquire a language implicitly. It's based, again, on the assumption that adults somehow can learn a language the same way that children do, as Krashen argued in his monitor theory, right? And take account of a learner's built-in syllabus. Well, there's been some research that we've done recently that shows that learners might well not have a built-in syllabus, that it depends on what's going on in the social situation of development, as Vogusky called it. That as a social environment has an effect on how people acquire a language. There is not a built-in syllabus, right? And then ensure that learners receive extensive L2 input. Well, I would agree with that if by L2 input we mean actual, explicit, intentional instruction in the language, because you're not going to be able to get sufficient input in a classroom to do much in terms of developing sophisticated knowledge of that language just through input alone, particularly for complex features like aspect in Spanish, word order in Chinese, motion verbs in Russian are very complex. And I don't see how you can learn that with a couple of 100 hours of input in a classroom. You need explicit instruction for that. So option 3 is the option I want to propose, which is a completely different theory. And Rod Ellis expressed, I talked to him about this several times, and he expressed some skepticism about this, because he says teachers and research inhabit different discourses. Well, I would agree with that if what we're talking about is SLS research and teachers' practice. But what if we have a way of integrating teachers and researchers into a unified, dialectically organized system where they're not speaking different discourses, they're speaking the same discourse, right? And the practice of research is different from the practice of teachers. Well, as Vogusky is going to argue, that's not so necessarily. The practice of researchers can be the same as the practice of teachers. And there's an inseparable unity between these two forms of practice, right? Researchers' theories, he says, are different from the theory that informs teacher actions. Well, that's true if we take this dualistic view where you have basic research on one side and practice on the other side. But if you can eliminate that separation, that dualism, and create a unified model, then we're not talking about different theories, right? And so on. And he says that practitioner theory is implicit, based on practical knowledge. Well, that's true, but it doesn't have to be that way. There's one of my colleagues in the University of Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona, Olga Esteve, is doing incredibly wonderful work, working with teachers on teachers and teacher educators on exactly answering this question, that bringing the theory and the practice together in a unified way with teachers so that they become active researchers and at the same time active practitioners. And it's based on Vogusky's theory. Okay. So the argument then that I want to make is that option 3 is not an argument for unifying existing theory and research, which is how I think Ellis is understanding what I was arguing. But it's an argument for a new theory, a theory that's grounded in practice, which is the dialectical unity of theory and practice. Now, so just briefly, dialectics, I don't have time to go into a great deal of detail on dialectics, but it's basically the unity and interchangeability of practice and thinking, practice and theory. So psychology's fundamental problem, as one of Vogusky's colleagues argued, Davidov, is to discover how the universal dialectics of the humanized world enters into the self-activity of humans. So it argues that if you want to look, the place to look for the human mind is not inside the head, but it's in the world. It's in the humanized world. That's where our consciousness comes from. Yes, we need a brain. Yes, we have a brain that can do certain things like remember and pay attention and perceive and all of that, similar to what other higher forms of animal life can do. But the key is how individuals appropriate what's created in the humanized world. And of course, the humanized world includes the world of education. So what we end up with then is a unity, a dialectical unity between, as I said, our biological inheritance, which we share with other species. So we have a natural attention. We turn to loud sounds and bright lights without thinking it's a reflex. And we have a cultural endowment, which we share through what we might call cultural genes, which are the symbolic artifacts that our cultures and societies have created for us, including language and the meanings and the concepts that reside in language. And so we end up with what Vogusky calls mediated attention, mediated perception, mediated memory, and so on, creativity, imagination, and so on. And the key element in all of this is language. It's language, and to a lesser extent, concrete activity in the world that brings the cultural genes, brings us into contact with the cultural genes. So we have two forms of inheritance, a biological inheritance and a cultural endowment. So learning, Vogusky says then, learning how to direct one's own mental processes with the aid of words or signs is an integral part of the process of concept formation. And concepts are created by cultures. Concepts imbue humans with the ability to control their natural and biologically endowed mental processes rather than to be controlled by them. So animals have a hard time controlling their instincts. They react instinctively to certain events in the world. Humans can react instinctively, but we also can react culturally because we have this other feature to our mind, to our consciousness, which is our cultural endowment, which is concepts. And I'll say more about that in a little bit. So when you think about what it means to be a human being, if you look at the dotted line, there is a direct connection between the person and the world. That's our biological endowment. But we have this other kind of inheritance, our cultural inheritance, which is the concepts, the artifacts, and the activities that we engage in that mediates our relationship to the world. So that what is at first social, right? As we grow as children, the social activity that we engage in and the language activity that we engage in with our parents and other members of the culture and the society becomes psychological. And this liberates us from the concrete situation. Children have a hard time until they begin to acquire language to understand the world beyond the immediate environment in which they find themselves. And they can't think about the past or the future. They can only think about the current concrete situation. And what Vogusky says is that speaking, liberates us from the concrete situation in which we find ourselves. Okay, so the theory then is a theory of praxis. Sorry. The greatest difficulty, Vogusky says, in genetic analysis consists precisely in using experimentally elicited and artificially organized processes of behavior to penetrate into how the real world, the real process of development occurs, right? That's how he sees it. The enormous problem of transferring the experimental outline to real life always opens up before genetic research. Genetic research for Vogusky is studying the history of development, the history of cultural development. What is, and this what I have in caps here is really important. He says, what replaces the hand of the experimenter who deliberately evoked the process in the laboratory? And what I'm going to argue is that what replaces the hand of the researcher is, in fact, the teacher when it comes to education, or the therapist when it comes to clinical issues, and so on, right? We must obtain data non-experimentally, he says. That's the key to praxis, right? So he says this really important quote. He says, previously theory was not dependent on practice. Instead, practice was the conclusion, the application, an excursion beyond the boundaries of science. That's exactly what the SLS people were worried about in applying with caution, right? You first do the theory and the research, and then you worry about the practice, the application, an excursion beyond the boundaries of science. He says, an operation which lays outside science and came after science, which began after the scientific concept operation was considered completed. Success or failure had practically no effect on the fate of the theory. And that's exactly what people who argue for basic research in SLS argue, right? If what we say happens in the laboratory doesn't happen in the classroom, that's not the problem of the laboratory. And Vogusky is saying something quite different. He says, now the situation is the opposite. Practice pervades the deepest foundations of the scientific operation and reforms it from beginning to end. Practice sets the tasks and serves as the supreme judge of the theory, as its truth criterion. You don't look in the laboratory, you look in practice to find the truth of the theory. If the theory does not improve practice, there's something wrong with the theory. It dictates how to construct the concepts and how to formulate the laws. So, Dafermos again says, theory building takes place through a reflection on practice. Theory derives from practice and goes back to practice. Not from the experimental laboratory to practice, but it starts with practice and it goes back to practice. If the practice doesn't sustain the theory in some way, then you need to rethink the theory. Okay. So Vogusky says this interesting argument. He says education is the artificial development of the person. But by artificial, he doesn't mean fake. He means intentional. He means it's the intentional introduction of signs by an external agent, a teacher, into an ongoing flow of activity. It influences and restructures development in a most fundamental way. So education is not just about learning, it's about becoming different, it's about changing, it's about development, right? So he makes a real interesting distinction then between development in the everyday world and intentional development in the world of education, which is systematically organized, not spontaneous, but intentional. So let's just get to the, I'll just sort of summarize what kind of theoretical practice or praxis we're talking about. One of Vogusky's followers, who his name is Piotr Galperin, developed an approach to not just pedagogy, but an approach to education, but an approach to psychology with regard to how you make the transition from the social to the psychological. And he brought this into education in what he calls systemic theoretical instruction. So it's based on explanation, presentation of a scientific concept. By scientific now, he doesn't mean, physics and biology. He means anything that's systematically, conceptually organized in a unified and rigorous way. And then that must be materialized and concretized in what he calls the schema for the orienting basis of an action, or what we call a SCOBA. It must entail communication. It must entail goal-directed oral and written performance, such as in Bob DiPietro's strategic interaction. And it must include dialogue, verbalization, two kinds of verbalization he talked about, communicated thinking and dialogic thinking. And I was interested to hear Aisling mention that she's interested in dialogue. Galperin was very interested in dialogue, because dialogue, communicating with somebody else, how you understand the concept and how you use a concept, and communicating with yourself in self-dialogue or private speech, is part of the process of internalizing the social and making it psychological, right? And so the final step is then the internalization or the proceduralization of the knowledge. So this is what we call, we brought Galperin's model into language instruction and what we call the concept-based language instruction. And this is our pedagogical wheel, we call it. The first step then is to challenge and modify learners' pre-understanding. So you need to first start the process of development with what the learners already know about a particular concept, even if it's in their first language, right? They may not know anything about the concept in the second language, but you can ask them, how do you express certain kinds of meanings in your own language? So that's the result of everyday knowledge prior to instruction. What is communication for? Why do people communicate? How do people communicate? And then the next step is to explain the scientific concepts or academic concepts. This is what we call the unit of instruction. Now, what we've been using in the CBLI pedagogy is largely a combination of cognitive linguistics and systemic functional linguistics, Halliday and cognitive linguistics, Langacker's cognitive grammar, and Lakoff's metaphor theory as a unit of instruction. And this has to be presented to learners in a visual way. And I'll show you an example of this in a minute. So it's not just a verbal explanation, because Galperin said, if you present learners with a verbal definition of a concept, they're going to want to memorize it without understanding it. And so what you have to do is you have to materialize the concept. And that's much more memorable, and it's holistic, because language, of course, is sequential. An image, whether it be a diagram or with younger children, we often use actual objects, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. And sometimes we engage people in haptic behaviors that can be very powerful. And then we have to concretize this in practical activity, depending on what your preference is, tasks, or drama, or strategic interaction, or some such form of pedagogy where they have to make a connection between their understanding of the concept and their use of the concept. And then they need to verbalize what Merrill Swain calls languaging, right? How do I understand the concept? Explain it to myself and to somebody else. And how do I use this concept to create meaning? What am I doing when I created this written text or spoken text, right? How am I using this concept? And it doesn't have to be used exactly the way native speakers use. So it's a more of a liberating and empowering approach to pedagogy. So learners might be able to use the concepts in ways that native speakers of a language just don't. And the final step is to internalize the concepts and use the concept then to guide the learner's performance. And this is what we call the Vogusky Wheel, and that's Vogusky there. So let me show you an example of a SCOBA. Maybe some of you have seen this in our 2014 book. This is one of my students, Haewon Lee, who wrote a dissertation on English particle verbs. This is a way of representing the particle, English particle, out. And there basically has 4 meanings. And we derive a lot of this from cognitive linguistics. But we don't expect learners to learn the jargon, the meta language of cognitive linguistics. We try to make it pedagogically understandable. And we visualize it in ways that are memorable. So most learners, when they see this SCOBA, right, they remember it, and they remember it quite well. So out has basically 4 meanings, as you see here, represented. Out of a container, moving out of a container, movement out of a group or set, moving out of a container, and increasing in size. And here are some examples of that. So I took the mug out of the box. That's a literal use of the particle, all the way down to, we picked out a name for the baby, which is a metaphorical meaning, which actually represents number 2, right? And what we find is that just actually one exposure to the SCOBA, the learners remember it quite well, and they can respond to these illustrations pretty easily, instead of having to memorize particle verbs. Another one of my students did a dissertation in Taiwan with high school students, teaching noun-verb collocations, and looking at things like the difference between make and do, right? And she represented it this way. So make, you start sort of with nothing and you end up with something like make a cake, bake a cake, make coffee. And do, right? So this is sort of a telic process, because you get to the end. And do is kind of a durative process, because when you do business, you do a job, you don't make a job, right? It's just continual. So this is her way of representing the difference between do and make. And here's an example of one of my students who did a dissertation on teaching Chinese word order using the famous Cuisenaire rods from mathematics, and that were used in the old days from Caleb Gattegno's Silent Way, showing them how you can manipulate, how you can learn how Chinese topicalizes objects, place adverbs, and time adverbs, and you can't move the verb in Chinese. The verb sort of remains in situ. And he actually used the rods, the real rods, and had the students manipulate them. And here we see a learner. This was very interesting. This learner had a low working memory capacity. She had a really low working memory capacity in both English and Chinese. But it turns out, so you would have predicted that she would not be a very successful learner. But it turns out that she was as good as any of the other students who had a higher working memory capacity. And you notice what she's doing. When she's speaking, she's using her hands to manipulate the rods, but the rods aren't there, right? So she's doing this, but but there's nothing in front of her other than her hands. And it's helping her to compensate for her diminished working memory capacity, right? And this is exactly what Vogusky meant by finding the right form of mediation to help people who, quote unquote, have problems, right? And this student took advantage of it and was actually quite fluent in using Chinese topicalization. So the conclusion then is, what I'm proposing then is a unified theory that overcomes a theory-practice dualism. It's a theory, a praxis-based theory that doesn't separate practice from theory. It's that theory informs practice, practice informs theory. But if the practice doesn't meet the specifications of the theory, you've got to look at the theory, not the practice, right? So education then is developing new forms of symbolic mediation, not available in the everyday world. We don't use rods and scobas in the everyday world. There's no separation between basic and applied research. They're the same thing, right? Applied research is basic research. Basic research is applied research. SLA is not the same in different social environments. The dissertation on Chinese word order tested Pieneman's teachability hypothesis, in which he has argued, I'm sure you're familiar with it, that if there's a developmental sequence, teaching cannot help students skip the sequences. But in point of fact, my student, Shan Zhang, showed that in fact you can skip developmental sequences with the right kind of mediation, with the right kind of pedagogy. So there's no internal syllabus that determines order and sequence of acquisition. It all depends on what goes on in the social environment. And the quality of instruction are the key to SLA. SLA then is explained through the lens of a general psychological theory. That's why I think Vogusky's theory is so powerful, because it accounts for pretty much all of our psychological higher human functions. And education and language instruction is part of that process, but it explains so much more. It's not a theory developed specifically for second language acquisition or second language practice. It's a theory of what it means to be a human being psychologically. So that's that. I'm happy to entertain questions.
Oh, I feel like we should virtually give you a round of applause. I know that's not the done thing, but just thank you very, very much. Wow, there's so much. Thank you, Mel. Yes, thank you. Yes, there's so much for us to engage with. And also, I'm sensing a part 2, possibly sometime in the future.
Well, I have a part 2, but maybe at some point I would be happy to do it.
Brilliant.
But yeah, sure.
Thank you. But I know that there are many colleagues here. I see the list of names, and so I don't want to hog the space. So the floor is absolutely open for questions. My 2 colleagues, Ian, Colin, will take organised questions from the floor, as it were, the hand space, and my colleague, Dr. Turkan, will organise from the chat space. So. There's so many things to ask. So, but I will.
Please. Anything is legitimate. Nothing's off limits. You can ask anything. You can disagree. You can do anything you want. Feel free.
Would it be all right if I stopped the recording for the questions? Or do you want to keep recording for the questions, Aisling?
Oh, it doesn't matter to me.
Doesn't matter to me as long as it's okay. Questions okay.
Okay.
Great, thank you, Aisling. We're going to move on to the questions now. If anyone would like to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand, and we will get to you in turn. And perhaps maybe to kick us off, some of the centre colleagues might have a particular question for Professor Lantoff. Mel, did you have a question?
Sorry. Sorry, yes, I was actually going to ask Professor Lantoff to stop screen sharing now, so then we can see your face better.
Oh, okay. I will stop sharing.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
I think, Caroline, you have your hand up. do. That was a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it, and I have one question which may touch upon, when I ask this question, it may evoke a lot of groans. And what the question has to do with is, you talked about the separation between research and practice. And I wonder if the procedures that now are considered commonplace with getting ethical approval and consent serves to separate researchers from practitioners more than almost anything else, if it basically has had a detrimental impact on the dialogue between researchers and practitioners. And also when practitioners become anonymous, but researchers get their names on the articles, how does this process impact those two communities and those two communities working together?
Yeah, that's a really good question. First of all, I think that this, what we call here IRB approval, has gotten so bizarre and Byzantine that it almost discourages people from doing any kind of research. And when they first started, it was like a 2-page questionnaire. Now it's pages and pages and pages and pages and pages that you have to respond to, and you never get through the first time or the second time or the third time, and it's really quite discouraging. And it's one of the reasons I retired. I just couldn't stand it anymore. I just couldn't take it, and my students struggled, doing their dissertations, trying to get through this maze, right? But I think what I would want to argue is that, and this goes back to the Olga Esteve that I mentioned, who's working in Barcelona. She doesn't separate out the practitioners from the researchers. The practitioners are the ones that are doing the research and publishing papers on the practice that they're doing. And it's not considered teacher research. It's considered research, period. And they're publishing things in some pretty decent journals, right? So I think this teacher research idea is part of the dualistic thinking. We have basic research here, and we have theoretical, and we have practice-based research over here. And Vogusky's saying, no, that's a false dichotomy. The practice-based research is the real research. And so when you work your way through his writings and through his research and the research of his colleagues, it's always the practice that matters to Vogusky. It's not, they did very little, let's say, experimental laboratory research. And if they did, they immediately brought it into practice. Either in his clinic, he had a clinic that was called the Clinic for Defectology, which dealt with people who had learning problems, worked with deaf individuals, blind individuals, trying to find new ways of mediating them so they could develop in a normal kind of way. And that's for them, that's what counted as research and to prove the truth of the theory, right? So I wouldn't want to make this distinction, you see, and I think that's part of the problem. And as we know, basic research is always more valued than teacher research. But I'm arguing that we don't want to make this distinction anymore. And this is what my colleague Olga is doing in Barcelona. She would be worth getting in touch with. She does really interesting work on implementing this particular concept-based language instruction with teachers and teacher educators. And she's done wonderful work and does workshops in many parts of the world. So if you're interested, I could put you in contact with her. I think she's worth listening to.
Absolutely, because I completely, your words are music to my ears, because it's the dichotomy that I don't want to have exist.
Yeah, because one of the things that her students are doing, her teachers and teacher educators, they're going on to get the PhD, and they're going back to the classroom to teach.
Fabulous.
The Barcelona public schools, and they're doing the research in the Barcelona public schools. That's what's so nice about what she's doing, So
that's great. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank you, Professor Lantov. Next, we'll go to the chat. We have a question. I think my colleague Sultan is going to read it out for us. There's a question that's come in from Maria Freddy, who is one of our guests. So I'll pass over to Sultan.
So Maria says, very interesting talk. Thank you. How do you think increasing multilingualism of the global society we live in is affecting what you call the cultural endowment in second language learning? Is multilingualism affecting biological inheritance as well?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, Vogusky was one of the first people to write about the effects of multilingualism on thinking, on consciousness. And he wrote a very relatively short paper, but it was quite profound and anticipated by almost 8 decades, 9 decades, the work that's being done now in psychology and psycholinguistics on the effects of multilingualism on thinking. And so one would guess, and this is a really interesting question, and we've done some work on this. Does learning more than one language, whether you learn them simultaneously in childhood, or more interestingly, when you learn them sequentially, say in adult life, you learn your first language as a child, then your second language or a third language in adult life, does that have an effect on how you think? Can you think through a second language? And one of the places that we've been looking to find evidence of this is actually the dialectical unity between speaking and gesturing. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of David McNeil at the University of Chicago and Gail Stam, and we've done some work on this as well. You can actually see people's thinking on their hands. And it turns out that different language communities think differently than other language communities for certain kinds of conceptual knowledge. So one of the interesting topics is motion verbs, motion events. How do languages encode motion events? So if you compare a language like English to a language like Spanish, Spanish does not have a lot of motion verbs in it. It has basic past verbs and a couple of manner verbs. But English is just full of manner verbs, right? In English, you don't just climb and run, and you can skedaddle, and you can trudge, and you can slog, and you can skip, and you can hop, and you can do all kinds of things. You can't do that in Spanish. So one of the interesting questions is, even if a Spanish speaker or an English speaker is speaking the other language, what kind of gestures do they use in concurrence with their speaking? And that should tell you something about their internal thinking process, right? And as it turns out, most people can't make that switch. You can speak in Spanish. I speak Spanish pretty fluently, but I suspect that I would have a harder time gesturing appropriately in Spanish. And there are certain ways that co-speech gesture occurs in languages, right? So for example, in English, you can string together a whole bunch with one verb, and you can string together a whole bunch of what are called boundary crossings. So you can say in English, the boy ran into the house, up the stairs, and into the bedroom. One verb and 3 prepositional phrases. You can't do that in Spanish. You have to have a separate verb for each boundary crossing. So you have to say he ran into the house, he went up the stairs, and he entered into the bedroom. And how you gesture that event is going to be very different in English than it is in Spanish, right? So I think that's a really important and interesting question. How does this globalization affect our cultural endowment and our thinking? That's the point. Now, whether it affects the biological inheritance as well, that's also an interesting question, because one of the things that Vogusky argued was that once culture gets into the act, it restructures the brain into a different kind of functional system. We know, for example, that people who are raised in chronic stress, such as people who live in poverty and are stressed out about their life and all things that go along with it, have a decreased working memory capacity because it affects the neurotransmitters in the brain. So that's culture, right? That's culture. That's society. It affects how you think. There's no question about that. So we all start out the same biologically, but depending on the social situation that we have access to, we come to think in a different way. And what Vogusky was about was ensuring that we maximize a person's capacity to develop. It's not saying everybody will develop to the same extent, but everybody has to have equal access to development. And that's what he was about. That's why practice is so important for him.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Lanthoff. A few people have their hands up here as well. The person who's been waiting, I think, the longest is my colleague, Sin Wang. So I'll pass over to Sin Wang.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thanks, Professor Lanthoff, for your very inspiring talk. So I have a question in relation to one of the notions that you talk about, that it's important to accumulate a body of knowledge, regardless of the nature of knowledge, whether it's generated through research or practice. I myself is very interested in research synthesis in applied linguistics. And in fact, I'm currently developing a typology of research synthesis with Luke Plonsky, who you may know.
Yeah, I know
who is leading this research synthesis movement. And what we found so far in our analysis of published research synthesis is that there is a lopsided focus on synthesizing research findings. So implying the hierarchy of knowledge, saying that research generated findings are of higher value and the practitioners are to look upon them and to generate some practical ideas or insights from them. I wonder, from your notion of having a unified theory, is there a role that research synthesis can play in it, that maybe we start to think about synthesizing practices in different contexts, not just synthesizing published research or theoretical constructs? Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think first of all, one of the problems is if there are 18 different theories, like as I pointed out, just counting the ones in those 3 books, right? And each one of them is doing what Kuhn calls normal science, right? They're all doing very different things. So what UG people do as basic research is very different from what cognitive linguistics does, is very different from what Hallidaean linguists do, is very different from what skill acquisition theory does, right? So I'm really interested in the project that you mentioned, right? How do you synthesize all of this to make sense, right? But I think what I'm arguing for is something very different. I'm arguing that, and this may seem a bit presumptuous, I'm arguing that this is a theory where you don't have to worry about synthesizing all the research, because the research is, in fact, an accumulation of what you find in practice. And it fits within this theory. So all you have to do is go back and forth between the theory and the practice. And we're not looking at what other theories and research is saying. We're staying focused on this particular theory as a dialectical theory of practice. Is that making sense? So I applaud you for doing the work, and I think it's a really tough task to try to synthesize all of the findings. But Vogusky is arguing that there's not a hierarchy. There isn't basic research on the top and practical research on the bottom. They're equal. As I said, basic research and practical research is the same thing. They're not separate. They're not separate. As Vogusky says, the ultimate truth criterion of your theory is how well it works in practice. If it doesn't work in practice, you got to go back and reconsider the theory, instead of just walking away and saying, okay, my theory's right, your practice isn't any good. No. Now, what we're doing now is we're looking at how this particular theory plays out in different cultural environments, for example. So we're doing work in China. We're doing work in the Middle East. There are a lot of people in the Middle East doing research within this particular model, right? In Australia, and of course, across North America. Some parts of Europe, like Olga in Spain. Brazil, there's a large group of people working in Brazil. So how does it play out in different cultural environments where you have a different social situation of development? But the theory is still the theory, right? It's still making a claim that your mind is always mediated. period. But how that mediation happens can be different, right? That's the point. So I applaud you for, and I look forward to seeing your work, but it's not a question that we would ask. Right?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Lantolf. We have another question from one of our guests who's joining us today, Hitomi. Hitomi, are you there? Do you want to turn on your microphone or your camera to ask your question?
Sure. The camera is on.
Yeah,
can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can indeed.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Lantolf. Interesting and refreshing to hear the criticism against the dualism. And then I love the quote of tyranny of irrelevant expertise.
Yeah. I like to.
So, anyway, now my question is, I was really happy to read about the Douglas Fir Group's movement. And I was wondering, you know, what followed from that. That's one question. Well, I mean, obviously, influence must have been immense, and not in a sort of an overt way, but in a sort of a implicit way. Maybe the Barcelona project that you mentioned probably are right in the spirit of the Douglas Fir Group's multicultural educational research based in context. So yeah, it was so refreshing and encouraging to hear about that. Now, the second question is the dualism. Why don't they go away? And one of the reasons is the prestigious journals still rely on scientific publication, and applied is so intricately entwined, the factors wise, and therefore it's very difficult to actually write a coherent article. I guess we can report a project, but it often is rejected because it is a local project and it doesn't have the international sort of a core scientific implication. So those are my two questions.
Yeah, I think the Douglas Fir Group morphed into something different than what myself and some of my colleagues in sociocultural theory thought it would morph into. I still think it supports, excuse me. I still think it, while it's made progress, I still think it represents, let me say it this way. It still represents a dualistic underpinning. And I still think it doesn't, it isn't looking enough at the psychology of learning, of development. It's looking at the social, but it's sort of moving away from the other part of the dialectic. So dialectics have two poles, right? You have the social and you have the biological, and then you need a merger of the two, right?
Yeah.
That's what gives you a dialectic.
That's right.
And you get a synthesis. But I think what you see in the Douglas Fir Group is more the social side and very little of the psychological consciousness side. And so we were pretty unhappy with what came out of that. I can tell you that.
I see.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other question was
the journal. I mean, the dualism.
Oh yeah, that's a real problem. You know, we have a journal now called Language and Sociocultural Theory. You may have seen it or not. And we publish a lot of practice-based research. Most of our work is practice-based research. And that's living up, I think, to the spirit of what Vogusky was trying to do. There are some journals in general psychology, well, general education, mostly more in Europe than in North America, that are willing to publish. There's a journal called Cultural Psychology and another one called Human Psychology that is willing to publish sort of what we would call practical pieces, because they understand that the practice is the way you verified the theory, right?
Indeed.
Yeah, but the problem is the dualism has been so ingrained in the
Yes.
thinking in the West in particular, that it's really hard to break out of that. And I must tell you, it took me a long time myself, because I was brought into academia in a dualistic way, right? And it took me a long time to figure out.
Yeah, phenomena exists, and then various studies try to interpret it. But then there comes the isms, and then it distorts the actual phenomena itself.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, but anyway, thank you very much. By the way, I'm from the University of Liverpool, and we are kind of related. You are working in XJTLU now?
Yes.
All right. So hopefully
you know
in the
that?
future.
You know that university?
University of Liverpool.
I know, but you know Xianjiao.
That is the Chinese branch. Well, there is a collaboratory relationship.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, I have an adjunct appointment there.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sure.
So our next question is from the chat box from Gulnahar Begum. She's asking, my question is about the theory and practice. A theory may match with the practice in one context. Is there not a chance that the same theory may not match with the practice in another context?
Yeah. Well, let me say it this way. You need to look carefully at what's going on in these different contexts. This is what the theory refers to as, there's a distinction between the objective social situation of development and the subjective social situation of development, right? So when a child is born into a community, right, there is a certain social surround that that child is raised in. And that we might call the objective social situation of development. But how that environment is refracted through the child is a subjective social situation of development. So you could have two children in the same objective social situation developing differently because of their subjective social situation of development, or you can have the same child at different times in their life in the same objective situation, but reacting differently to it because they become different over time. So as you develop, the way you so for example, when a child is born, the people around them are speaking the language all the time, but the child can't deal with that until they reach a certain age, biological maturity, usually be late first year, beginning of the second year. But as they gain more and more language capacity, that environment subjectively changes, but the objective environment is still the same. So what you have to look at is how does the same objective situation of development. So let's say you have a classroom of 20 students, and you're engaging them in a particular lesson using the SCOBAs that I showed you. All the students may not react to that in exactly the same way because of who they are. And so you need to take account of that difference. You understand? So you need to distinguish. You can't assume that just because I treat everybody the same way, I'm treating them equally. So what I think is unfair treatment is to treat everybody the same way. That's what Vogusky was very much opposed to. You have to treat people in different ways. And that's the whole basis of the zone of proximal development and dynamic assessment as the assessment outgrowth of the zone of proximal development. So you need to provide different forms of mediation for different students in ostensibly the same environment. So you can't assume that everybody will react in the same way. However, if you discover that nobody is developing, then you need to rethink your theory. There's something wrong with it, right? And one of the things that Galperin did, by the way, when he was developing what we call the wheel, he would experiment in schools. He did over 800 studies in the various public schools in the Soviet Union at the time. And he would leave out certain steps within the theory to see if it made a difference. So he left out, for example, the languaging part. Does that make a difference in how children learn? And it turns out it did, right? He left out the the starting point, the pre-understanding, and see if that made a difference. It did. So it turns out you need all of these parts of the model to make it work as effectively as possible.
So can I follow with a question, and actually maybe a statement, maybe in addition to the crisis that you stated in your presentation, Professor Lantoff. So one of the crises that I see is the division between bilingual education and second language studies. So this SLS or SLA tends to position L1 and L2 as sort of separate entities and two separate language systems operating separately, and then the learner is habituating into these language systems. Whereas the translanguaging based pedagogies really are quite making an impact in the field, and shifting the way we look at second language acquisition from traditional model of bilingualism towards more like dynamic model of bilingualism, which is in accord with this whole idea of dynamic assessment, dynamic, that fluid nature of language, right? Accounting for that fluid nature of language. So I was so happy to hear that you were centering Vogusky's idea that activity is at the center, the practice is at the center of what language learners do, right? And that's our object of analysis. So from that premise, and when we look at bilinguals, even though, let alone or let go of these labels as second language learner, foreign language learner, or what have you, any language learner is really what any language learner is doing is really assembling the features of the languages in their repertoires. They are not assembling separate language systems or acquiring or appropriating affordances of these separate language systems into their, let's call it like interlanguage or so, right? So I'm bold in stating this maybe, but I'm seeing that the crisis might be missing that element of how historically second language studies has separated language systems and really positioned L1 and L2 through traditional models of bilingualism. And so I guess that's my comment to you, and the question is, how do you reconcile bilingual education and second language studies? Because when you actually do that reconciliation, you may actually be looking at the practice and what bilinguals do, no matter FL learner or second language learner, and get to the bottom of the ways in which they assemble their resources, language as well as cultural resources in their repertoires.
Yeah, I think.
Curious to hear your thoughts.
I think that I think for what we would traditionally call second language learners like myself who learn Spanish at university, I think that's a very different process because it has a different starting point than, let's say, bilinguals who are raised in two languages or acquire a second language very early on in school as children. I think what you get is you get a different kind of integration going on. And so that's why I said before, the interesting question that we ask in terms of somebody like myself is, to what extent can these two systems actually integrate psychologically? Now, socially, I have no problem speaking Spanish, right? I'm fine speaking Spanish, but I'm not sure that I would argue that I have an integrated system. Interestingly, I also speak German, but my German, I never studied. German I learned because my wife is German, and we spend a lot of time in Germany, so I learned it on the fly, and I think that's actually a more integrated system than my Spanish system is. Even though I'm better in Spanish than I am in German, my German system is more integrated. I'm not very literate. I have a hard time reading and writing German, but I can speak it better than I can read and write, because I've never been educated in German, right? So and that's what Vogusky meant by the social situation of development. So the social situation of development for a bilingual can be quite different, both in and out of the classroom, right? Than it might be for somebody like the way I learned Spanish or French, right? One language in the home, my first language, and my other language. And so the interesting question is, can they be integrated into some sort of unified hyper system? And I think in some cases that's possible, and I think in some cases it isn't. That's why we're interested in looking at, one of my colleagues, Gail Stam, has been following a Spanish speaker who's been immersed in the US. She works in the US. She works in a firm in Chicago. She was born and raised in South America, and she's been living in the US for about 20 years. And she's been following her longitudinally for many, many years to see what happens to her gesture speech integration. And it doesn't go together. Her English is quite fluent, but her thinking is still, if you look at the gestures, it still shows up as Spanish when she has to talk about things like motion events. So she hasn't made the integration yet. Now, it's interesting what happens to bilinguals. So there are two studies that I know of that looked at bilingual children raised in Miami, Cuban Americans, and Chicano Americans raised in Los Angeles, looking at their gesture speech situation. And what you get is a hybrid. So they don't look like English native speakers, and they don't look like Spanish native speakers. They're a hybrid. They have an integrated system, and they have these resources that you're talking about, but they don't look like either one. They look like a third possibility, right? So yeah, I mean, that's all I can say about that.
Okay.
Now, so one of the interesting questions is, how do people who speak more than one language, whether you're ostensibly a bilingual or whether you're somebody like me in Spanish, whether you can think through the other language when you deal with problem solving, right? And we've done a couple of studies there, and it shows that even very fluent second language speakers of either Spanish or English, when the problem gets too difficult, they can't deal with it in the other language. They have to switch to their native language, or they can't solve the problem. They can't do it. So there are all kinds of interesting questions that are raised about that, but it all has to do with the social situation of development.
Right. It would depend on the context that the person is socialized into. I mean,
yeah, right.
Like I am really just thinking in English when doing academics, but I have no resources in academics when it comes to Turkish, while using Turkish. And so it's just contextual mediation, which Vogusky would argue.
My wife had that problem when she got her PhD in the US based on sociocultural theory. When she went back to Germany before we got married, she had to teach in German, and she couldn't because she didn't have the concepts in German, because the social situation of development was different. She didn't know how to talk about Vogusky in German.
Yeah, I wouldn't either. So we have a few more questions. My colleague Mel has hand up, and then Ian, do we have another question in the chat box? I'm not sure, but we'll go with Mel first, and then Gumnahar.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lantal, for this talk. There was so much that you said that I was writing down, and it resonated with the research I do. I loved your discussion of the criticisms of SLA informing pedagogy. I work a lot in Indigenous language contexts, and I'm sure you know that Indigenous language educators have long critiqued some SLA theories for just sort of not resonating with their own context.
Yeah. Yep.
I also really liked, as Hitomi mentioned, that you talk about the tyranny of, what did you say? The tyranny of
irrelevant expertise.
Irrelevant expertise, yeah. And it got me thinking, and this actually kind of, I think, ties into what Sin Wang was asking about, maybe a synthesis of contexts, because teaching contexts, they vary in many ways, but it sounds like generally SLA is really focused on a pretty specific kind of teaching context. And I've been thinking about, as you're talking about how we need theory that talks to research, or that talks to what teachers are doing, what teachers find works should inform theory. But that still is what teachers find works in a classroom context that I don't know how translatable that is to language use outside of that context. I guess this kind of touches on what a lot of my colleagues have been bringing up. And how does this sort of the praxis work when we're thinking about like human development broadly, like almost like a learning scientist perspective? How does that work when we're talking very specifically about teachers in classrooms, when actually like there are arguments for like there being a tyranny of irrelevant classroom contexts when it comes to like language use in the world and multilingual language use? And I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the most important dialectical thinkers within this framework is a guy named Ewald Ilienkov, who wrote some pretty heavy theoretical pieces. He was a philosopher, but he also wrote about education. And one of the things he said, although he wasn't referencing necessarily language, but he was referencing things like history, mathematics, economics, and so on. And he says, if the students cannot take what goes on in the classroom and move it outside of the classroom, it's failed. You're a failure. You have to have the means of getting the students to take what they learn in the classroom and apply it in the real world, where there are real flesh and blood people doing real practical kinds of things, right? So that has to do very much with the wheel, with I think it's the fourth part of the wheel, which is what kinds of activities are you doing in the classroom that can reflect possibly the uses that students will have of the language outside of the classroom. So what comes to mind, for example, would be things like service learning, right? Environments. But one of my former students who now works at the University of Navarra in Pamplona, Spain, has been doing some interesting work there with his graduate students, exactly trying to follow what students do when, because they teach Spanish and English, what the Spanish learners do when they go out of the classroom in Spain, and how they can take or not what they learn in the classroom and move it out of the classroom. Now, my position is, if you have conceptual understanding, and I didn't say a lot about that, but if you understand the concepts of the language, that is, what are the kinds of meanings, for just take an example from Chinese, what are the kinds of meanings that you can express through the various options of Chinese word order, right? And that's fairly complex, particularly when you compare it to a language like English, where we don't have a lot of options for moving things around. But if you understand that concept, and you can use it to do a lot of tasks, even if they are in the classroom, I don't think you have to have an exact match as to what goes on in the classroom and what goes on in the real world. I think if they internalize the concept and they can use the concept in traditional like task-based learning or drama or whatever you use, they ought to be able to take that knowledge and use it outside of the classroom. I don't see why they wouldn't. If you've internalized the concept, and you don't have to use it the same way native speakers would, right? Particularly when you're dealing with something like word order, which is very optional in Chinese. It's not a rule, it's a discourse feature. So how you construe an event depends on the eye of the beholder. and you can construe it in one way or another way. And that's what learners have to learn. And it's really difficult, by the way, when you're dealing with learners who've come through a system of rule-based learning, to get them to jettison that way of thinking, right? What's the rule? They want to know what the rule is. Well, there are no rules. There are concepts. Here's the concept. I just showed it to you when I showed you the particle verbs of out in English, or the difference between make and do. It's not a rule. It's about the conceptual meaning that you want to make when you use these particular linguistic features, right? Whether you're talking about metaphor, we've done some interesting work with metaphor, which is really hard to master in a second language, right? But if you, the prediction would be if you've internalized the concept and you can use it in a wide array of activities in the classroom, you should be able to take it out of the classroom. Now that needs to be verified, of course, and that's what at least my colleague in Spain is doing.
I do think there are some learning scientists who might say that learning and acquisition get a little blurry, that a lot of expertise and knowledge is emergent, from the context of use, that even like integrated systems, it depends on where you are, who you're, who the interlocutor is, and that it may not be, quite so clear sometimes. Yeah.
But that's why the social situation of development is so important. It depends on how the individual refracts, not reflects, but refracts that environment in which they find themselves, right? But if they've internalized the concept, then they should be able to deploy those resources in a wide array of contexts. But they may not do it in exactly the same way as other learners or other speakers of the language might. That sort of doesn't really matter.
Great, thank you very much, Professor Lantoff. We have another question here from the chat, from Morgan Mattingly. And I'll just read it out for you here from the chat. I'm curious if Vygotsky's theories of cultural endowment, symbolic artifacts, mediated attention, etc., relate to the work of the sociologist Bourdieu, who theorized about economic, social, cultural, and symbolic capital. They seem to be very interwoven. What would your thoughts be on that?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think one of my favorite researchers within sociocultural theory is a man named Karl Ratner, who has written a lot about the interface between Bourdieu and Vygotsky. He has a wonderful book that I highly recommend to you. It's called Macrocultural Psychology, and it's precisely about all of these factors of economic, social, cultural, symbolic capital and how they affect the thinking process. And I saw one of the questions that's not up there now, but I caught my eye, that had to do with the economic factors, the economic circumstances. And Ratner has a splendid model bringing Vygotsky, I would say, what I would call neo-Vygotskyan perspective, into the 21st century. And he looks at things like racism through the lens of Vygotskyan theory. He looks at things like economic deprivation through the lens of Vygotskyan theory, or economic, let's say, superiority in how people think, given their economic background, their cultural background, what control they have over the symbolic spaces in which they live, right? What Bourdieu calls symbolic capital. So I think, I think that's really important, and I think I would recommend looking at his work. He has a really interesting book called Neoliberalism and Vygotsky, which is really interesting, particularly in the North American setting these days, right, where neoliberalism has basically run amok and causes all kinds of problems in American society. But he has some really interesting things to say about that in terms of the kinds of activities that people engage in throughout their life. As I said, dealing with race, economics, sexuality, education, all kinds of things, and showing how Vygotsky can inform our understanding of those different kinds of circumstances. And Bourdieu is one of the people that he relies on fairly heavily.
Great, thank you very much. We have no more questions in the chat. My colleague Caroline your hands up, Karen. Have you another question for us, or maybe your hands up from before? But if not, I'll pass back over.
My hand up went accidental. Sorry.
No problem. Thank you. So without further ado, we'll pass back to Aisling then, who I think might have a question, and we'll wrap the event up for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Your microphone is off.
Sorry, that was, sorry, yes. No, I was caught unawares. I thought Ian was going to make me finish and I hadn't answered my question. So just as same as everyone else, thank you so much. I think there's so much for us all to think about. Some of the things, I suppose I've got far too many questions, so forgive me if they all come out at once. I suppose, but I know that very much of us are very grounded in practice, and even, you know, continuing what we do in an academic setting, very many of us will also be working in sort of more practical settings, and it has always been difficult. I find it has always been difficult to believably explain things like order of acquisition, the research on it to the teachers who are sitting in front of me, because I don't intrinsically believe a word of it because of my experience in classrooms. You know, it's very easy to be able to try to explain to teachers, you know, children do miss steps in stages and they do it for these particular reasons. So I think there may well be teachers who are very sold on or already don't have to be convinced about the dialectic unity of theory and practice. And I'd love to get a hold of some of those teachers who are going and doing their PhDs and getting back into classrooms, because I think that's, you know, that's you know, hairs on the back of your neck kind of stuff. So, but I also know that we have to balance off, right, well, where's your data and where's your evidence? And I think it does go back to what Hitomi mentioned earlier. But I know that we are looking at different types of data, but we do need data. And I think when you think back, as you know, as you're thinking about that 1996 paper about writing it as a presentation of this is, you know, we need to prepare our arguments for what is going to come and what we don't want to come. What are the kinds of arguments that we ought to be preparing around? Is it about different types of data? Is it about how we capture the social context, or how we evidence the social context? And I just wondered if there are, you know, we can look at, as you would know, you know, we look at corpus linguistics and to give us lots of examples of lots of instances of use, or we look at conversation analysis to go through and fine detail the, you know, a 30-second extract to prove that this thing happened. And I just wonder if there's something that we can be doing or should be doing, or, you know, would point in the direction of saying something about data that makes the change that might have to happen in relation to unifying theory more convincing.
So let me say a couple of things about that. I think, first of all, I think you don't need to have huge ends to be able to generalize. I mean, that's sort of a fallacy of the psychometric view of things, right? You need a big N to be able to generalize statistically, but you can generalize to the theory. And that's one of the points that Vogusky makes. You know, he says, how many steam engines do you have to study before you know how a steam engine works? Or how many frogs do you have to dissect before you know the anatomy of a frog? Well, one, right? So I think so there are different ways of looking at data and what counts as data. And I think we've been wrapped up so much in this statistical paradigm that you can only generalize if you have a huge N. Well, for certain things that might be so, like the vaccine, right? You know, you need a lot of people who come from different kinds of backgrounds. That's why you need 30,000 and 40,000 people, because you need to look at all of these variables, right? But I think when you can generalize to a theory, does this support the theory? Does the theory support the practice? I think you can generalize very much in that way. I don't think you need to have these huge statistical ways of doing things. And even here's the danger, right? So if you do a large study, let's say you have 100 participants in your study, and you get a 60-40 breakdown. Now, chances are that it's going to be statistically significant. But what do you do with the 40% of the people who aren't responding to your treatment, right? They matter. You can't just conclude that because I'm using this particular methodology that it's going to generalize to everybody on the basis of my statistical analysis that shows a significant effect where you get 60 people responding positively and 40 people not. Well, what about the 40 people who aren't responding? We don't often pay attention to them. And those are the people that Vogusky is interested in. How can we get those people to develop, right? What do we have to do? Why are they not responding, right, to the pedagogy? And the other problem, I think, is in a lot of these studies that have ostensibly supported the natural sequences in classrooms, they've often compared the predictions to traditionally taught classes. So we never really know, they never really describe in a lot of detail what's going on in these so-called traditionally taught classes. And what we're arguing for is if you can organize the instruction in a systematic way that makes theoretical sense, then you don't have to worry about these so-called built-in syllabus, because your pedagogy will override that. But if I'm thinking particularly about Pieneman's work on teachability hypothesis. He did a lot of work comparing his predictions to what goes on in the classroom. But if what goes on in the classroom is kind of not systematic, it's eclectic, well, is that a fair comparison? So now I have to think that, depending on what you're exposed to, let's say in an immersion setting, that's going to have some effect on what you acquire and when you acquire it. But I don't think, I remember acquiring German word order. I had very little problem with that. And I acquired it sort of all at once. I didn't have to go through, the main clause and the embedded clause. I just got it straight away, right? From the environment. I just did it. So I think what counts as data is kind of driven by the theory in Vogusky's model, right? It's driven by the theory. And so whatever aspect of life you want to look at, that's going to determine the kind of data that you collect, right? So one of the most interesting studies that Vogusky did was a sort of natural experiment where the Russian government at the time brought literacy and education into the rural communities of the former Soviet Union in the 1930s, right? And as part of the collectivization process. And Vogusky predicted that when you look at the rural communities in terms of who went to school and who didn't, you're going to find a different way of thinking. And so how are you going to show this? Well, you need to collect you need to look at certain kinds of data. So, because one of the things that we know about what happens when people go to school is that's where you learn to think taxonomically. If you haven't been to school, you tend to think functionally, right? So they had to develop a data elicitation paradigm for how are we going to uncover the evidence that supports our prediction. If you change the cultural environment, if you change the social situation of development, and you compare the community that's been to school with the community that hasn't, you're going to see differences. But what are we going to look at? So they developed a whole series of tasks that try to see if people could think taxonomically or functionally. And it turned out that people who went to school had no problems with taxonomic thinking, but the people who didn't go to school couldn't think taxonomically at all. They thought functionally. So if you gave them sort of these analogy tests, right? So if you show them a picture of a glass, drinking glass, a knife and a fork, a dish, and a pair of eyeglasses, and they say which one doesn't belong, right? So if you've been to school, you would say the eyeglasses don't belong. But if you haven't been to school, you say they all belong together because I need my glasses to see what I'm eating. Right? So you think functionally. Now, neither one is right. It depends on what you're doing in the world. So sometimes functional thinking is really good. And sometimes it's not so good. And the same thing with taxonomic thinking. So thinking taxonomically can be good. And sometimes it's not so good. Functional thinking is better, depending on what you're doing and what the social situation is like, right? So the theory, as Vogusky would say, kind of determines what kind of data you want to look at and how you want to look at that data.
I think, thank you. I mean, yes, it's I mean, I just think about the papers that we read in a week, and you know, a lot of the papers written by the journals that we're reading, you know, it is all, you know, hard data and you know, quantity, and we know that. And even when we talk with other colleagues, oh, we're doing a small scale study. Oh, we'll never get it published in there because we haven't got enough data. And that, and I know that's been around for quite some time. And I think sometimes it would be much more refreshing to be able to read lots and lots of other more theory-based.
Yes, I think that's the bane of second language research these days. Is it's so heavily empirical under the Anglo-American view of what counts as science. It's all empirically based, even though most journals would say it has to have a theoretical component to your article has to have a theoretical component. But proposing a hypothesis is not a theoretical component. That's a hypothesis, right?
Yeah.
So I wish that they would open up space in these journals for more theoretical pieces. And I think that's missing. And I think it's missing from a lot of the graduate education that we do in our language or applied linguistics or SLA programs. We don't really engage people in theory, real serious theory. What theory is it? Theory in science, what theory does and doesn't do. But it's all about methodology, right? It's all about that research methodology. And there's not much space in journals for real theoretical pieces, right?
Thank you very much. I see more questions coming through, so I'll shush. So please go ahead.
If we have if we have time for one more question,
Yeah, sure.
Yating Liu has her hand up. Yating, would you like to unmute and
thank you very much. Okay.
Yes, I can.
Hi.
Hi, Professor Len Tov. Thank you very much for this brilliant talk. I'm a PhD student at Queen's, and my research focuses on teacher research in higher education. That is, university educators in all kinds of disciplines do educational research to improve teaching and learning. So I'm quite excited to hear you see teacher research and teacher-researcher collaboration as two of many solutions to crisis in SLS, which I couldn't agree more, because it's a very powerful tool to bridge theory and practice. And knowing that you work in Xi'an Jiao Tong University, I was wondering how you think of the development of teacher research in China. That's my first question. And another question is, what do you see as future directions for social cultural theory and teacher research in language education and education in general?
Wow. Wow. Okay, so let me say this. I think there is, in China right now, there's a lot of interest in sociocultural theory, in second language learning and teaching. We've actually set up an East Asian group that includes China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, that we've had several meetings, conferences over the past several years, where people come and share their research that sort of follows along the group that we've had in the US for the past 27 years, which is kind of a working group where we do work in progress and people can come and share their work and get feedback from the participants and the audience. If you're interested, we're going to have, as soon as the pandemic is over, probably in 2022, we will have a meeting in Pamplona, Spain, of our group. And you're very welcome to come and just if you want to hang out or just present some of your work, that's fine. And it could be grad students, whatever. And you can just come with an idea. It doesn't have to be a full project. You can just come with an idea. What do you think about this idea? And we're happy to engage you. And it's been very productive for the people. And so something similar is going on in China. One of the problems that I think Chinese academia is confronting is, I don't know whether this is good or bad, but there is a lot of pressure on Chinese academics to publish in the SSCI journals. And if they don't publish in those journals, they don't get a lot of credit for their research. And there's some really good research being done there, but if it doesn't appear in the right journals, they're not going to get credit for it. So for example, our journal is not an SSCI journal, it's a Scopus journal, which actually has a bigger population of journals than SSCI. But the Chinese Ministry of Education has made it the assumption that you have to publish in these right journals. And so that, I think, kind of, one of the things I think that does is it creates less of a risk-taking on the part of scholars, because you want to do safe research that you know is going to be published and acceptable in the right journal. And so you don't take a lot of risk in putting something out that's really new and different. Because I mean, when we started out with doing sociocultural theory, people didn't know what to make of it. They had no idea what we were talking about. And I remember the first article we published in 1985 with my colleague Bill Frawley. We submitted it to Applied Linguistics, and at the time Bernard Spolsky was one of the editors, and he had no idea what we were talking about. It was their paper on discourse and private speech, and he didn't know what the hell we were talking about. And luckily for us, he was at the University of New Mexico, where one of the leading Vogusky scholars in the world at the time, Vera Johnsteiner, was on the faculty. So he showed the paper to her and asked her, should this be published? She said yes. So because of that luck of fate, we got started, right? Things started out, but otherwise, you know, it's you know, when you do this kind of really cutting edge, interesting research, and that's why I think some of the theoretical pieces just sort of don't fly very well. We have this mindset that it has to be heavily empirical and so on. Now they're doing some interesting research in Shanjiaotong on bringing together what they call diagnostic assessment with diagnostic cognitive assessment with dynamic assessment. And they're doing really interesting work there. I'm very impressed with it. We're proposing a special issue of a journal, I won't say which journal, on some of that research that's being done in China on dynamic assessment. I don't want to mention the journal because it's not accepted yet. But we're doing, and we have another one, another special issue that we're putting together on East Asian research, on second language teaching and learning, bringing together scholars from these four areas: China, Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. And so, yeah, there's a lot of really interesting work being done there.
Thank you very much for sharing your opinions and ideas about all these questions I asked.
Sure.
Great, thank you very much. I think that's all of the questions, Professor Landhoff. Thank you very much for taking the time to answer all of those so comprehensively. It was wonderful to hear all of your insights and experience that you bring to the launch of the centre today. I'll pass back over to our director, Aisling, to close today's event.
Thank you.
So thank you, just to reiterate, so thank you very, very much. It's so rarely that sometimes we get opportunities to have such lengthy question and answer, so it is incredibly appreciated. So thank you very, very much indeed. I was slightly serious. I was chancing my arm, I think, asking you about part 2, but please, I think we'd all very much like to hear part 2, and so please, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, great. It's easy when you stay home. I'm happy to do it whenever it's convenient for you. Sure.
Thank you. That's really great. I just really appreciate that. We have some upcoming events for the centre, and I know there's been some comments in the chat box. So I'm just going to try and share just a final slide, if that's okay. That might be easier said than done now. Can you see that, everyone?
Yeah. Yes, we can see it.
Yeah.
It's a bit small, but
sorry. Does that work?
That's us now. Great.
Brilliant. Okay. So I know just in the chat box people have been asking about staying in contact. So we have a number of upcoming events. Dr. Burbat and Dr. Sylvan Turkin have organised a webinar with Dr. Fiona English talking about professionalism in the language teacher, looking at linguistic knowledge of teachers. Dr. Singwon Chung is running the BAL Researcher Development Series. So that's coming up. The first session is on the 5th of February. Please come in here, colleagues, if you want to mention any more detail about those events, either Sultan or Singwon. We also have, running through the centre, we're going to organise a series of lunchtime talks. And the first one sort of kicking off is with one of our esteemed alumni, Dr. Robert Ping-Nan Chang, who's going to talk to us about the transition of doctoral studies. And we also have Singwon's BAL Researcher Development Series. It's there as well. We will be circulating these through our website and Twitter, which will be available shortly. And you're also invited to 2 events there. One is Dr. Singwon Chung is giving an invited speech at Swansea University on feedback literacy, and also then again on the research synthesis in applied linguistics in TESOL. I know Singwon has mentioned that, so that might be something that you're encouraged to engage with. We will make, so if you have participated, I'm going to turn that off. So if you have registered for the event, I will have your email, and so I will be able to connect with you in that way. If not, please feel to connect with us in any other way, and from each of our email addresses. We will be sending out invitations if you want to become more involved in the centre, and we are, as I think we've communicated, an open space, and one which is really interested in talking and engaging with lots of people in different perspectives. So I would just like to say thank you very much. Colleagues, please, have I missed anything that I should have said and I didn't? You're shaking your heads. Would anybody like to just say anything? There's a lovely dog in the background there, Mel. It's great. Yeah, no, just a very final word of thanks to Professor James Lantoff. It has been amazing to have the opportunity to listen to you and to engage with you today. We really, really appreciate it, and very much looking forward to the next one, be it online or in person. So
yeah, wouldn't that be nice in person?
It would.
I want to thank you too. I enjoyed the session. I enjoyed the questions. They were great. I always enjoy the give and take. It was a good experience for me as well. I always profit from it. So thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think we all deserve a round of applause. In real life, that's what we would do. So, or dance, whatever teacher fancy. Brilliant. Okay. Thank you very, very much.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.